boys and girls. We are continuing our discussion about plot in 3rd grade today. Plot is important events in the story. How we find the plot is we look for the beginning or the exposition. We find out what the characters and the setting are in the story. Then we look for clues about the problem. This is called rising action, when things are kind of starting to go wrong with the problem in the story. The climax is at the top of the roller coaster. It's when the conflict or the problem is at its peak. It's when everything is going wrong in the story. They haven't figured out how to solve it yet. Falling action is when the story slows down and they begin to kind of tie everything together. We call that tying up loose ends. Resolution is the end of the plot, basically. It's when the conflict or the problem is solved or resolved. Good readers identify the plot to help them keep track of the events in the story. Good readers know what happened in the story and when it happened. So today, we are going to finish reading Thank You, Mr. Falker. If you remember, when we stopped last time, Mr. Falker was standing behind Tricia, and every time she drew something, he was filling her bucket. He was telling her what a great job she did when she drew. So even though she couldn't read, she had the strength of being a great artist. That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her. All except Eric. He sat behind Tricia for 2 whole years, but he seemed to almost hate her. Tricia didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her and pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground, leaned in her face and called her Toad. Tricia wasn't afraid to turn any corner, or Tricia was afraid to turn any corner for fear Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who teased her. I could make an inference here. I can put my background knowledge about teachers who support students and the text evidence. He let her do things special. He looked mean at kids who teased her, and I can make an inference that Mr. Falker is standing up for Tricia. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Tricia, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom and to jump out and call her stupid or ugly. And Tricia began to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide under the inside stairwell during the free time and not have to go outside at all. In that dark place, she felt completely safe. I'm thinking about bucket filling, and I'm feeling like they have emptied her bucket all the way. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" he laughed, and he pulled her out into the hall and danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, maggoty old dumbbell." Tricia buried her head in her arms and curled up in a ball. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office. When he came back, he found Tricia. "I don't think you'll have to worry about that boy again," he said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," Tricia shrugged. Tricia was sure Mr. Falker believed that she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence. Then she'd say the same thing that he did. "Good," he would say. Then one day Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and help wash the blackboards. He put on music and brought out little sandwiches as they worked and talked. All at once he said, "Let's play a game. I'll shout out letters. You write them on the board with the wet sponge as quickly as you can." "A," he shouted. She wiped a watery A. "8," he shouted. She made a watery 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q, he shouted out. He shouted out many, many letters and numbers. Then he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Tricia knew that none of the letters or numbers looked like they should. She threw the sponge down and tried to run. I'm feeling like she was probably embarrassed. But Mr. Falker caught her arm and sank to his knees in front of her. "You poor baby," he said. "You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so lonely and afraid." She sobbed. But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters or numbers the way other people do. You've gotten through school all this time and fooled many, many good teachers." He smiled at her. "That took cunning and smartness and such bravery." Then he stood up and finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, girl. You're going to read. I promise you that." Now almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. They did a lot of things she didn't even understand. At first she made circles in sand and then big sponge circles on the blackboard, going from left to right, left to right. Another day they flicked letters on a screen and Tricia shouted them out loud. Still other days she worked with wooden blocks and built words. Letters, letters, letters. Words, words, words. Always sounding them out, and that felt good. But though she'd read words, she hadn't read a whole sentence, and deep down she still felt dumb. And then one spring day, had it been 3 months or 4 months since they had started, Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She'd never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of the page and pointed at it. Almost as if it were magic, or as if a light poured into her brain, the words and sentences started to take shape on the page as they never had before. She marched them off to. Slowly she read a sentence, then another, and finally she'd read a paragraph, and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. They were so proud of her for working so hard. That night, Tricia ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open her front door, and ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up on the cupboard and grabbed a jar of honey. Then she went into the living room and found the book on a shelf, the very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned honey on the cover and tasted the sweetness and said to herself, "The honey is sweet and so is knowledge, but knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of a book." Then she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel tears roll down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. She was happy, so very happy. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know because that little girl was me, Patricia Polacco. I saw Mr. Falker again some 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and introduced myself. At first he had difficulty placing me. Then I told him who I was and how he had changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me and asked me what I did for a living. "Why, Mr. Falker," I answered, "I make books for children." "Thank you, Mr. Falker. Thank you." So when I think that I am done reading the story, I start to think about the plot. Like, what events were in the story? So I think back to the beginning of the story and the exposition. The beginning of the story introduced us to the character of Tricia and her grandparents and her family and how much they loved to read. The rising action of the story was when she started to discover that she was having trouble reading. And then the climax, the big part where all the kids were teasing her so badly, was back here in the story. Remember this part? They were making fun of her, and she even had to hide to feel safe while she was at school. That was the climax, when all the action was happening at once. The falling action was when Mr. Falker discovered her, and they started to begin to help her learn how to read. And she started to get stronger and grow her reading muscles. And then the resolution, the end of the story, was when she went in and she got the honey and she tasted it on the book again. So you can see how we read the whole book, but then we could go back at the end and we could build our plot map just like we did on our anchor chart. So that's it for plot, boys and girls. I hope you have a great day.